Welcome back to the Everything History podcast. It's been a little while since I've been able to record the podcast, and this has been the case because I had final exams and papers, and I also traveled to Vienna, Austria, and a few other places to study crisis diplomacy, which may have inspired me to detail the history of a few interesting crises in 19th century European history. But anyways, I don't want to get too far into any of that right now, so I present to you episode 32, the Mutina Civil War.
I discharged my last duty as king and emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
I ended my last episode on Augustus Caesar in the summer of 44 BCE, specifically during the funeral games of Julius Caesar put on by the young Octavian Caesar. And to reiterate the quotation from Suetonius, quote, "A comet shone for 7 successive days, rising about the 11th hour, and was believed to be the soul of Caesar," end quote. Yes, so throughout the games of Octavian, the people saw this massive comet and quickly came to the conclusion that it was a sign that Julius Caesar was becoming a god. This coincidence was absolutely perfect for Octavian because it happened during his funeral games, and it now meant that he could be seen as the son of a god. And the comet of Caesar is also mentioned by the two great Augustan poets Virgil and Ovid. Ovid's passage in his Metamorphoses is quite notable and says, quote, "Then Jupiter, the father, spoke, 'Take up Caesar's soul from his murdered corpse and change it into a star, so that the deified Julius may always look down from his high temple on our Capitol and Forum.' He had barely passed when the gentle Venus stood in the midst of the Senate, seen by none, and took the newly freed soul of her Caesar from his body, and prevented it from vanishing into the air, but carried it towards the glorious stars. And as she carried it, she felt it glow and take fire, and loosed it from her breast. It climbed higher than the moon, and drawing behind it a fiery tail, shone as a star." End quote. You can also be sure that Augustus had a hand in such poetry, and after the Civil Wars, Augustus will mint several series of coinages that depicted the comet on one side and his own likeness on the other. Now, thanks to this comet and the tremendous success of the games, Octavian was now launched, like the coincidental comet, into the forefront of Roman politics. No longer could he be ignored, for he now had the backing of the people, and apparently had the backing of his divine adopted father. He also had the loyalty of a small army as well, about 2 legions in size at this point, but he was still untested in battle, and in this episode you will learn how the young Octavian managed to navigate the increasingly dangerous politics, and even small outbreaks of civil war, as the Roman Republic began to fissure and tremble as the Senate, the murderers of Caesar, Octavian and Marc Antony all struggled for power. Throughout this episode, you may also be wondering what the conspirators are doing. I will mention Decimus Brutus Albinus quite frequently, but Cassius and Marcus Brutus are not in Italia in the narrative of this episode. That is because they have left Rome to seek support elsewhere throughout the Roman Republic. They have the support of the Senate, but they need financial and military support from elsewhere because they know they have to contend with Octavian and Marc Antony, and they know it is far too dangerous to stay in Rome. And I'll begin pushing forward the historical narrative with another quotation from Suetonius. Quote, "The civil wars which the august Caesar waged were 5, called by the names of Mutina, Philippi, Perugia, Sicily, and Actium." End quote. This episode will cover the first civil war Octavian was involved with, the war concerning Mutina. So as of the late summer 44 BCE, Marc Antony had taken command of the province of Macedonia. More accurately, though, he had taken over the armies of Macedonia, which is what Antony really cared about. But Antony desired the province of Cisalpine Gaul. For the full reasons for why Antony wanted that province, I refer you back to episode 30. This was granted not by the Senate, but by the army assembly. But still, the governorship transfer would not take place until the following year. This irritated Antony because he wanted to move his Macedonian armies into Italia, which is why he chose the governorship of Cisalpine Gaul, because that province is in modern-day northern Italy and would allow Antony to position his armies near Italia and Rome. Why did Antony want to be back in Italia and the city of Rome? Well, because Rome was where everything important happened, and if you were absent, things could go badly for you politically. Also, Antony wanted to make sure the Senate, led by the great enemy of Antony, Marcus Cicero, was not conspiring against him with the upstart Octavian. And thus Antony arrived some weeks later, most likely in August, in Rome with only his brother's army in Italia because the Senate refused to allow the transfer of his Macedonian armies. And when Antony arrived, he quickly came into conflict because he found the rumors to be true, that Octavian was in the good graces of both the people and the Senate. Antony did not fear the Senate, but he did fear the outrage of the people and feared that Octavian was trying to turn the people against him, which, by the way, were legitimate fears because that was exactly what Octavian was trying to do. So upon his return, Antony used his power as consul to disturb and deride Octavian at every turn. He refused to allow Octavian to dedicate a gilded chair to his father, Caesar, and Plutarch tells us that Antony even, quote, threatened to send the young Caesar to prison, end quote. Octavian reacted to this not spontaneously or with anger like Antony was off to do. Instead, he pleaded to the Senate and, more importantly, to the people, the plebeians of Rome. Indeed, Appian details Octavian's oratory response. Quote, he exclaimed against Antony, "O Antony, do not be angry with Caesar on my account. Do not insult one who has been the greatest benefactor to you. On me heap indignities to your heart's content. Cease plundering his property until the legacy to the citizens is paid. Then take all the rest. However poor I may be, my father's glory, if that remains, and the distribution to the people, if you will allow it to be made, will be all sufficient for me." End quote. And that there is an exceptional political response from the 18-year-old Octavian. Now granted, Appian recorded this response over a century later, but his contemporary writers also refer to this direct incident, and Suetonius specifically refers, in his biography of Augustus, to many primary sources that most likely survived to Appian as well. But it is good practice to question the validity of the ancient historians. Nevertheless, look at what the young Caesar was able to do with that comment. He was able to accuse Antony of attacking the elder Julius Caesar without using accusatory language, and he was able to play the victimized pious son by telling the people that Antony could, quote, heap indignities to his heart's content on him, so long as he left his father Julius Caesar out of it. But even more, Octavian was able to bring up the fact that Antony still refused to give him his inheritance. But note how skillfully Octavian brought that up. The younger Caesar did not bring up the will or the vast amount of money he was being withheld directly, because no Roman would sympathize with such a patricianary problem. So instead, Octavian admitted his current state of poverty, thus playing the victim and gaining the oratory advantage of sympathy, and by asking Antony at least to pay out the 300 sestertii to the plebeian class that Caesar's will had promised, a sum of money that the evidently selfless Octavian had already begun to hand out, even in his state of relative poverty. And if Antony agreed to this seemingly humble demand, then that would be, quote, all sufficient to Octavian. Thus the young Caesar once again outmaneuvered the elder Marc Antony. Suetonius, Plutarch, and Appian all describe Antony as being enraged at how Octavian had turned the people against him. But his close confidants and army officers managed to guide Antony towards a sensible response. Antony publicly reconciled his differences with Octavian, stating that it was a misunderstanding. He was under the predisposition that Octavian had been disrespecting him as a Roman magistrate and his elder, and with that, Antony met Octavian on the Capitoline Hill to publicly reconcile. Plutarch and Appian both describe this meeting, although Suetonius skips over it in his biography. And the histories tell us that the two also agreed to a loose political alliance, an alliance that foreshadows their future relationship. I say that because the alliance did not last longer than a few days because of Antony's paranoia of Octavian, and because the young Caesar realized that Antony still had no intention of ratifying Julius Caesar's will. Antony's paranoia, according to Plutarch, first came to him in a dream where Antony was struck by lightning in his right hand. Antony took this as some sort of sign, and he received word shortly after his ominous nightmare that Octavian had sent assassins to kill Antony. No such plot was found, and Octavian disavowed any notion of conspiracy, but Antony went into another frenzy of emotion and sent word to his armies to be brought across the Adriatic Sea into Italia. The Senate and Octavian suspected that Antony had designs on removing Decimus Brutus, and the Senate warned Antony that he could not enter Cisalpine Gaul until the next year. The Senate also stated that a move against Decimus Brutus would be a move against the Republic and thereby an act of treason and civil war. Octavian, for his part, remained silent at this time and waited for another opportunity as the Senate and Antony fought in the early weeks of autumn, politically that is. Octavian was struck with a problem of his own. He could not keep his small army together. The soldiers did not desire to fight another civil war, and wanted to go home to their farms and protect their families from the dangers they foresaw between Octavian and Antony. Octavian allowed them to do so without retribution, for he knew that he could do nothing to halt them at this time. Instead, Octavian focused on gathering information and sent emissaries to Antony's camp in Brundisium and to the camp of Decimus Brutus near Mutina to acquire information secretly. Octavian was prodding and looking desperately for a weakness, and the emissaries found one. They discovered disloyalty in the camps of Antony. The emissaries reported that the soldiers of Antony were displeased at Antony for not pursuing the murderers of Caesar. They openly wondered where their general's loyalties really lied. Octavian took advantage of this situation by ordering his emissaries and messengers to distribute leaflets and spread word that he, Caesar, was seeking proper retribution for his father and was willing to pay, and pay even more than Antony. And all of these messages were signed simply by the name of Caesar. Octavian was already, at this early moment in late 44 BCE, beginning to create and craft his image, for he already referred to himself only as Caesar. And as I have mentioned before, that name carried great weight among the people and the soldiers. And the infiltration and subterfuge campaign by Octavian was paying great dividends. Quickly Antony realized he had a problem as his camp began to talk openly of Caesar. Fearing desertions, Antony sought retribution against the emissaries of Octavian, who he referred to as, quote, the rash boy. He captured none, however, furthering his own anger and animosity towards Octavian. Not wanting to allow his legions to sit idle, Antony then decided to move his army towards Rome and try and prevent desertions to Caesar. He also promised his legions that he planned to move against the conspirator Decimus Brutus soon. In fact, as Antony approached the city, the sources indirectly mention that Antony issued an ultimatum to Decimus Brutus demanding early turnover of Cisalpine Gaul. Yet if Antony thought that approaching Rome and drawing closer to civil war would stop the defections, he was wrong, because as he got closer to Octavian, the more the name of Caesar was invoked. Nevertheless, no en masse defections were taking place, and Antony's plan as of October 44 BCE was to go to Rome, denounce the actions of Octavian to the Senate, levy more soldiers from the Tiber River area, hopefully get the support of the Senate and the people, and then make his way to Cisalpine Gaul with hopefully around 6 legions. Antony did not make it known, however, if he planned to use force against Decimus Brutus, but the Senate certainly assumed that the rash Antony would. But setbacks began to occur as Antony made camp outside Rome. The soldiers began to flock to Octavian, and the soldiers that had left Octavian to go home began to return to the young Caesar, and even old veterans of the elder Caesar began to re-enlist under Octavian. Antony accelerated his plan as a result, and made for the Senate in full military uniform and guard. But before he could address the Senate, he received word that 2 entire legions had transferred their allegiance to Octavian. This forced Antony to once again improvise, and he decided not to address his quarrel with Octavian, but instead give a short speech that amounted to nothing at all. He then returned to his Tiber camp to quickly depart north against Decimus Brutus. Many senators and powerful plebeians saw him off, expressing their undivided devotion, but this was traditional practice. In truth, the Senate greatly despised Antony at this moment as he marched northwards, but they felt more content knowing that Antony now had only 5 legions, and that 2 of these were either veterans or freshly untrained legions. Speaking of armed forces, allow me to present the whereabouts and commanders of the many Roman legions as of October 44, excluding Antony, of course. Marcus Lepidus, who will soon be a primary narrative actor, had 4 legions in Hispania. A man by the name of Pollio had 2 as well in Hispania. Plancus had 3 in Transalpine Gaul, and Octavian had 5 legions, 3 of which were either fresh or veterans. And it can also be noted that Antony was the most senior commander amongst them all, also serving as consul, and despite the desertions still had the most able-bodied force, and Plutarch makes it clear that Antony was confident in both his own abilities and that the impending matter with Decimus Brutus would not involve the other legions in the Republic. In clearer terms, Antony wanted to keep his takeover of Cisalpine Gaul between him and Decimus Brutus because he might otherwise be outnumbered, and Antony was confident that this would be the case. His confidence, however, was misplaced. By the way, the Latin word trans means beyond or across, so Transalpine Gaul is a reference to the province just beyond the Alps. And cis is Latin for before or on the near side, therefore Cisalpine Gaul is the province just before the Alps. Now, Where does Octavian fit into all this controversy over Cisalpine Gaul? He has been playing it quiet thus far, simply amassing his forces and hampering Antony, and the young Caesar has been playing his strategy close to the chest, which you will find is a common theme in Octavian's career. He always kept his true objective to himself. This is one of the first cases we can see this in action. Therefore, I put it to you, what might Octavian Caesar's objective be in this crisis? This is a question I most assuredly encourage you to ask throughout the narrative of Augustus Caesar. It may seem a bit theoretical, and therefore a somewhat useless question, but that is not a good point of view. And if you're listening to this, I believe it's safe to say that you're already quite intrigued by such a question, even though it does sound like an essay question on an exam. Regardless, I think I've wasted enough time. The answer to the question is not entirely clear, because one could have multiple correct answers, although some correct answers would be more correct than others, if that makes sense. And this is the case because Octavian always used a multi-layered approach, and he would change his plans according to the situation. He would also avoid making too many assumptions, but the assumptions he did make proved to be almost always accurate. The former trait, that of adaptability, is a learned trait. The latter, that of decisive decision-making, relies on careful situation awareness and a large degree of talent. It cannot really be learned. Thus it is those skills that distinguished Octavian from his peers and made him one of the greatest politicians and leaders of all time. But anyways, the answer to the question, finally, is that Octavian intended to have the Senate appoint him to a military office in the event of civil war. That is intentionally vague, but more specifically, Octavian wanted the Roman Senate to order him to take up arms against Marc Antony, and by doing so, Octavian would not only have position over Antony, assuming victory, but it would also legally sanction his actions by the Senate. Octavian was a stickler for legality because he did not want anyone to have political leverage over him because he did something illegally. And in addition to all that, the Senate would owe Octavian as a byproduct of the Roman practice of clientela. And of course, Octavian would at last have an actual executive office to hold his hat on. That was his objective after Antony marched north. Now, back to the history. The Senate met with Octavian and praised the defected legionaries, and Appian states that the Senate made it known that the soldiers should have turned themselves over to the Senate's service, but that they were nonetheless content with the choice they had made to join Octavian. The Senate then retired, waiting for news from Decimus Brutus. The soldiers of Octavian pleaded for Octavian to ask the Senate for an appointment as pro-praetor so that he might have senatorial authority. Octavian, though, refused to ask the Senate because he believed the Senate would come to him. Appian actually quotes Octavian as saying, quote, "And all the more if they, the Senate, know of your zeal and my hesitation," end quote. This being the case in Rome, I shift focus to Cisalpine Gaul and the Po River Valley. Marc Antony arrived sometime in November and demanded that Decimus Brutus transfer his services and men to Macedonia. He refused, sending copies of letters from the Senate that stated his authority. Antony countered with his decree from the assemblies of the people, and Decimus Brutus still refused, and Antony marched against him. Or rather, Antony began moving on the cities of Cisalpine Gaul, all of which opened their gates to Antony. Thus the Mutina Civil War began, and it began small with very little violence in the early stages. Indeed, it seems that Antony was not even going after Decimus Brutus in the early weeks of his campaign, but rather securing the loyalties of the various urban centers. Decimus Brutus Albinus, however, knew that Antony would turn against him eventually, and he feared the wrath that the veterans of Julius Caesar might launch against him. He also knew that help from the Senate would be near non-existent for months, which is also the reason Antony was willing to proceed so slowly. Therefore, Decimus Brutus raised new recruits, likely well below 10,000 men, and assumed control of the city of Mutina, where he began preparations for a prolonged siege in hopes of holding out against Antony long enough for the Senate to send relief. Antony responded accordingly and besieged Decimus Brutus at Mutina, most likely beginning in late November. And Antony's circumventillation of Decimus quickly extended into the following year, 43 BCE, meaning his consular powers had expired and the new consuls, Hirtius and Pansa, took office, and while Antony still had the authority of imperium over his armies, his actions could be interpreted differently now that he was no longer consul. The Senate, led by Antony's political rival Marcus Cicero, was fully aware of this, and they convened immediately to discuss the actions of Antony. What followed is a very interesting debate in the Roman Senate that shows the intricacies and complex nature of the Roman political system because it reveals the importance of tradition, the power of influential senators, the power of being a consul or a former consul, and the unique role of tribunes and non-senatorial actors. and as I said, they convened immediately come the new year. Cicero made the case in the session to declare Marc Antony a hostis, an enemy of the state. This is a very serious measure if passed. It essentially means that the individual in question will be public enemy number one, and all Roman forces should converge against them. It is not a guarantee of their downfall, but it is one of the Senate's most powerful actions. And in this case, its passage would validate war against Antony. And if not passed, it would be far more difficult to defeat Antony. So naturally, on such a matter of grave importance, the Senate was split, and the divide quickly became between the supporters of Antony and the Ciceronian camp. Many senators were hesitant to cast a vote, and how great it would be to be a fly on the wall in these talks. The argument coming from Antony's supporters stated that such an action would go against the tradition of their ancestors because it was un-Roman to put a man on trial without at least requesting his presence in court. And it was certainly disconcerting and un-Republican to praise a Roman as consul yesterday and accuse him of treason the next. Cicero's argument was that Antony was launching civil war and breaking the decrees of the Senate and expressing great hostility towards the Republic. There was also the underlying understanding that Antony was attacking one of the conspirators that they agreed with and many considered tyrannicides, but this was left unspoken in the Senate. The Senate held session deep into the night and reconvened the next day in a nearly non-stop political debate until a side was favored. And at last a decision was made, but a tribune rose and vetoed the Senate's decision. The tribune was a man by the name of Salvius and was assailed by a barrage of insults, but the veto remained, and the Senate was unable to declare Antony an enemy of the state, at least at first. They did pass public decrees of support and praise for Decimus Brutus, but alas, they then had to turn to other methods to combat the power and actions of Marc Antony. And where did they turn to? Well, that's actually the wrong question. Rather, to whom did they turn to? Why, Octavian Caesar, of course, and his legions, which were stationed conveniently in the ancient city of Alba, very near Rome. They did so by sending the consuls Hirtius and Pansa to assist Decimus Brutus by relieving Antony by force. They needed armies, however, so they appointed Octavian as pro-praetor and sent him and the consuls to Mutina. Thus Octavian achieved his objective, but he still needed to defeat Antony. As Octavian marched, the Senate delivered an ultimatum to Antony. He must leave Mutina and leave Cisalpine Gaul, or he would lose his governorship of both Macedonia and his future province. They also threatened to declare him an enemy, and after the ultimatum, such a decree would likely hold up because Antony had been made aware of his judicial situation, meaning that he was aware that he was basically on trial. Antony refused, and he was finally deemed an enemy by the Senate, and the Senate awarded all of Macedonia and Illyria to Marcus Junius Brutus. The Senate also made Gaius Cassius governor of Syria. And you can be sure that Octavian was surely angry by the Senate's treatment of the murderers of his father, but he maintained his silence and came to battle Antony at Mutina in early 43 BCE. Yet I would also note that the Senate may have made a mistake by allowing Octavian to see their true motives. Indeed, the Senate made it clear to all that were paying attention that they favored the murderers of Caesar and desired to put the old followers of Caesar against themselves. This greatly affected Octavian's behavior because he knew now for certain that his greatest enemy was not at the moment actually Antony. Therefore, Octavian now knew that the Senate and the new consuls would try and strip him of his command of the armies. Thus, Octavian's true goal was now not the destruction of Antony, but the preservation of his own forces. And to do this, Octavian might well have to preserve Antony, because the forces and veterans of Caesar would need to stick together to oppose the Senate and the conspirators. That being the case, Octavian, Hirtius, and Pansa came into combat with Antony in the hills and marshes of northern Italia. At first they met in general engagements with Octavian's men alone fighting Antony's, but after Octavian's legion perished without retreat, Hirtius reinforced Octavian, and the two commanders, joined soon after by Pansa, pierced deep into Antony's camp, but in the following skirmishes Hirtius was killed in battle, and Pansa was mortally wounded and condemned to die. The two consuls of Rome were now dead or dying, and Antony retreated to the Alps in search of reinforcements from Marcus Lepidus, his former brother-in-arms under Julius Caesar, who Antony also knew was converging from Hispania via southern Gaul. Thus, through a very bloody series of battles, Octavian relieved Decimus Brutus from the siege of Mutina, and soon after Decimus summoned Octavian in hopes of making friends of the young Caesar. Octavian refused, angrily stating, quote, "I am not here to rescue Decimus, but to fight Antony, with whom I may properly come to terms with some time, but nature forbids that I should even look at Decimus or hold any conversations with him. Let him have safety, however, as long as the authorities in Rome please." End quote. Soon after, the Senate decreed a celebration and ordered that the legions of the fallen consuls and the remainder of Octavians be turned over to Decimus. In their decrees, Octavian was not mentioned at all, as the younger Caesar suspected would happen. The dying consul Pansa, however, summoned Octavian and stated his loyalty for Caesar's father and turned his legions back over to Octavian so that Decimus received only the newly formed and weak legions. Pansa also stated as he died that the Senate had ordered he and Hirtius and many of the new officers to keep Caesar and Antony against each other. But Pansa said that he secretly hoped to bring Octavian in alliance with Antony against the conspirators and supporters of the deceased Pompey. I end this episode there on that intriguing note. In the next episode of Everything History, I will detail the personal life of Augustus Caesar, and after that you will learn the next moves of Octavian and how he overcomes the machinations of Cicero, the Senate, and the conspirators. And of course, if you have any questions, corrections, or concerns, send them my way at everythinghistorypodcast@gmail.com.
Thank you very much.